In September 1848, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune shaved his head. He clipped on a fake braid. He pulled on a traditional Chinese robe and walked straight into the forbidden mountains of Wuyi. He was hunting for living tea seeds and the complete secret of leaf processing. A simple evening habit, a hot cup of tea, had pushed the greatest military power on earth into organized theft, stealing bushes off someone else's land. And the reason was purely mathematical. Britain's addiction to dried leaves had brought the City of London to the edge of default. In the final act of a decades-long conflict, an empire would be saved by portable glass greenhouses and stolen botanical source code. Picture yourself as a British factory worker in the age of steam. Long shifts at the loom, cold brick walls closing in. A cup of hot water with a spoon of sugar and a splash of milk gave you cheap carbs to survive the whole shift. By the mid-19th century, tea had stopped being a luxury for aristocratic drawing rooms. It had become the empire's basic fuel. Leaves were written into soldiers' daily rations. Sailors of the Royal Navy were issued tea on every long voyage. So how exactly did a drawing room luxury turn into physiological fuel for sailors at sea? The habit of boiling water for tea quietly saved hundreds of thousands of lives. It sharply cut the risk of intestinal disease in overcrowded industrial cities like Manchester. As historians now put it, the simple act of boiling water for tea did more for British public health than any policy decision of its time. No government planned this. It was a pure accident of cheap imports. Boiling water for tea had, without anyone intending it, become a survival mechanism for workers living in filth. The problem was that there was only one seller. China's Qing emperors recognized exactly one currency worth trading for: pure silver. Beijing's pride made the rules ironclad. European machinery, English wool, the imperial court simply had no use for any of it. By some estimates, the City of London was bleeding roughly 15 million silver dollars a year just buying tea. Silver bars sailed out of Canton's harbour on every East India Company ship, steadily draining the vaults of the Bank of England. This created a humiliating situation. The greatest naval and military power on the planet stood, hat in hand, at the one port China allowed foreigners to use, handing over hard currency for leaves in a bag. There was no substitute to switch to, and giving it up wasn't an option either. That meant shutting down factories across the country and risking outright famine riots. So to plug the hole in the treasury, Britain started smuggling illegal opium into China from Bengal, India, on a massive scale. A trade triangle took shape. India supplied the raw poppy resin, China paid for it in silver, and London scooped that same silver back up to buy its tea. This imbalance is what triggered the First Opium War. Gunboats shattered wooden junks. Diplomats forced their trade terms on China at gunpoint. Looking at the terms of the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, it's hard to call it anything but state-sponsored extortion. And yet, the economic absurdity never actually went away. Britain won the war, but tea still grew only on Chinese soil. So the East India Company funded a covert expedition. Fortune operated deep behind enemy lines. The mountain terraces of Wuyi grew the finest oolong in the world. Europeans were forbidden from setting foot there. Smuggling out living tea bushes or the secrets of how to process them was punishable by death, since officials treated this knowledge as a matter of state security. The Scotsman posed as a distinguished visitor from a distant province. His mission: document the entire production process, from the first leaf plucked off the branch to the finished bale, including the design of the wooden presses. It was here, in these forbidden mountains, that fortune finally confirmed China's greatest technological secret. Green tea and black tea came from the exact same plant. The only difference was the level of fermentation and the roasting technique applied to the leaves of Camellia sinensis. Until then, European botanists had genuinely argued over whether these came from entirely different trees. Fortune documented everything, methodically, hand-rolling techniques, precise temperatures for fixing and drying the leaf. Stealing the secret was only half the job. Getting a living seedling all the way to London seemed physically impossible. Seeds lost their viability fast. In an ordinary ship's hold, exposed to sea salt and constant mildew, they'd rot within weeks. This is where an elegant piece of technology saved the day. Wardian cases. Sealed glass boxes that maintained their own self-contained microclimate. Moisture evaporated, condensed on the glass, and dripped right back down into the soil. Living plants could survive months at sea without a single drop of watering from a human hand. The expedition ended with tens of thousands of seedlings and seeds smuggled out of the country. But fortune didn't stop at botanical samples. He secretly hired a team of experienced Chinese tea masters. Along with the seedlings and detailed blueprints of the fermentation equipment, they were quietly shipped off to India, where the colonial administration was already clearing land for future plantations in the Assam region. Thousands of tea seeds arrived in Assam, and so did the men who knew how to turn leaves into tea. Historians sum up the outcome bluntly. Tea experts, 13,000 seeds, and Robert Fortune's meticulous records rewrote the fate of an empire. By the time China realized what had been stolen, it was already too late. Living plants accomplished what admirals never could. They ended centuries of Qing dynasty monopoly. A simple habit among British factory workers ended up bringing down the largest trading system of the 19th century. Now rewind half a century before that Scottish agent ever packed his first stolen seedling, and the global balance of power looked completely different. The Qing Empire had spent centuries running itself as a vast, self-contained economic system. Beijing had zero interest in the outside world. British diplomats kept showing up with their finest goods: powerful looms, fine wool, sophisticated navigation instruments. The Chinese emperor looked at all of it as quaint, mechanical toys. In his worldview, Europe was a backward periphery, producing nothing but junk. The result was a historical arrangement bordering on the absurd. A naval superpower whose fleet set the rules from the Caribbean to India couldn't even trade directly in Canton. Why was the world's mightiest navy forced to ship out reserves of silver just to buy dried leaves? The mechanism behind this humiliation had a name: the Canton System. The Chinese government locked all legal European trade into a single port. Foreigners were confined to a tiny strip of land along the Pearl River. The 13 factories became an isolated business district for Western merchants, cut off from everything else. Every deal London's merchants made was boxed inside that narrow strip of riverbank. But even within that tiny strip, foreign merchants had no real freedom to act. Buying directly from farmers was off the table. The only legal gateway was the Kahong, a quasi-governmental guild of local merchants that held an absolute monopoly on doing business with outsiders. Guild members personally vetted every contact between visitors and the local population. The British East India Company was used to operating from a position of strength. Back home, it ran all of Asia as a tight monopoly, selling licenses to independent traders who wanted in. The company controlled entire regions, but at the docks of Canton, all that machinery ground to a halt. The Kahong dictated purchase prices to the British, no negotiation. They set their own exchange rates for foreign currency. Ship captains could sit for hours just waiting for permission to unload their cargo. Global British capital found itself completely at the mercy of a handful of local officials on foreign turf. The Qing state had built this system deliberately, engineered to squeeze every drop of value out of foreign traders while leaving them almost no room to maneuver. The Kahong monopoly would run unchanged for over a century, right up until the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. And since Chinese merchants had zero interest in European wool, there was only one way to pay: hard silver coin. Heavy clipper ships sailed east, loaded to the gunwales with bullion. The company's trade balance was in free fall. Every year, the drain of precious metal sucked liquidity straight out of the British economy. Imagine you're the director of the Bank of England at the time. You open the financial reports and watch national wealth flow, uninterrupted, into a closed country that buys nothing back. Quiet panic set in across the city of London. Capital flight threatened to drain the treasury dry. Chinese officials believed themselves untouchable. Foreigners were safely locked up on the riverbank, paying in silver at whatever rate they were told, with no way around the Kahong at all. Desperation breeds radical logistics. The East India Company hit a dead end with legal trade. There was no forcing a closed country to buy its industrial surplus. What it needed was a product that could generate infinite demand, one that bypassed every customs post ever built. Britain found its master key on the plantations of Bengal, and the target this time wasn't a market, it was human biology itself. In the pharmacies of Victorian London, a bottle of laudanum, an alcoholic opium tincture, cost less than a pint of decent gin. Britain's steep alcohol taxes had quietly created a strange domestic market, where a powerful opiate was the cheapest available remedy for everyday stress. Medical historians trace the drug's name back to the Latin word for praise, a name that captured exactly how the tincture was seen: a universal home remedy. Manchester factory women measured out drops of cloudy liquid for their infants before a 12-hour shift. The children were guaranteed to sleep until evening. Gentlemen treated their migraines and rheumatism with it. Until the Pharmacy Act of 1868, its sale inside Britain was barely regulated at all. And yet, this staggering level of domestic opium use never triggered social collapse. Factory chimneys kept smoking. The empire kept launching fleets and expanding its borders. Back home, there was simply no clear line between poison, medicine, and ordinary commercial product. Laudanum was just a convenient chemical tool for keeping the peace in Britain's overcrowded, filthy industrial cities. But 10,000 miles from London, that same poppy sap took on an entirely different identity. The East India Company grasped a simple logistical truth. This drug beat wool or machinery hands down, because it generated its own endless demand, hooking the user physiologically and blowing straight through any customs barrier. Bengal became the launchpad for this economic hack. British administrators repurposed enormous stretches of Indian farmland, forcing rice fields to become poppy plantations. Officials handed Indian farmers seed advances, then controlled every acre planted and bought the entire harvest at fixed, rock-bottom prices. In processing centers like Patna, thousands of local laborers worked in massive factories under British supervision. They dried the thick sap and worked it into a uniform paste. Then they shaped it into standard balls the size of cannonballs. The opium was crated up and shipped off to open auction in Calcutta. At that point, the East India Company formally stepped out of the picture. On paper, the company's books showed nothing but legitimate business. The actual crates were bought up by private, independently armed trading syndicates running fast clipper ships. This is where the deadly trade triangle actually began, in the Bay of Bengal. Private captains ran their ships through the South China Sea and dropped anchor off Lintin Island, right on the edge of Qing territorial waters. From there, local shadow networks took over. Under cover of darkness, dozens of fast Chinese boats pulled up alongside the floating warehouses. Smugglers loaded the crates below deck and paid in pure silver. That silver flowed straight back into the company's legal treasury in Canton. With it, agents bought fresh shipments of tea, which sailed home to feed the British market. Archival records from this three-way exchange reveal a brutal asymmetry of intent. In England, opium functioned like a cheap syrup, keeping the factory workforce running. For a closed-off China, it became a weapon of total financial devastation. The Indian export drove severe physical dependency, hijacking the nervous systems of millions of buyers. Addiction tore through the social hierarchy, top to bottom. Senior provincial officials took bribes in opium. Soldiers in southern garrisons pawned their own weapons for another dose. For decades, silver had flowed steadily out of British vaults into Asia. Now the resulting vacuum started pulling liquidity in reverse. To feed the growing addiction, southern provinces burned through their own reserves of precious metal. This triggered brutal deflation among the peasantry. Farmers sold their harvests for copper coin, but still owed taxes to the state in silver at the official rate. As silver grew scarce, its value shot up several times over. Peasants were wiped out overnight. State construction projects ground to a halt. By the late 1830s, southern China was sliding into total systemic paralysis. The imperial court in Beijing watched with mounting horror as the treasury emptied and its own administration rotted from within. The shadow smuggling networks had grown so vast that the central government had completely lost control of its own coastline. As entire regions collapsed, Emperor Daoguang was left with one option. Could raw military force possibly stop the bleeding and save the southern ports from total state collapse? Emperor Daoguang made his move. In 1839, a special imperial commissioner, Lin Zexu, arrived in Guangdong province with sweeping emergency powers and a direct order: stop the silver hemorrhage. He moved fast and hard, ignoring the usual corrupt arrangements that ran the southern ports. He shut down local opium dens, drove known dealers out of the cities, and blockaded the foreign trading houses along with the Europeans still inside them. British merchants were handed an ultimatum with no room for negotiation. Lin Zexu demanded they surrender every scrap of the banned drug sitting in their warehouses and aboard their ships. Roughly 20,000 wooden crates were confiscated. Picture the scale of that seizure, something close to 1,000 tons of opium. By the standards of trading companies at the time, this was capital on the scale of a national budget. Destroying that much cargo struck European merchants as pure barbarism. The operation at Humen took exactly 23 days. The opium wasn't burned. Officials didn't want a drug-laced cloud drifting over towns packed with thousands of people. Instead, crates were methodically opened, dumped into long trenches dug for the purpose, mixed with seawater and lime, and the resulting caustic sludge was flushed out into the ocean under the direct supervision of imperial inspectors. To China's ruling class, this looked like an act of civilizational self-defense, restoring lawful order to a poisoned society. Lin Zexu sent Queen Victoria 2 formal letters. His question was simple. If enlightened Britain banned this poison outright at home, on what grounds did it think it was fine to profit from poisoning someone else's population? Beijing's diplomacy leaned on Confucian principles of humane governance, appealing, hopefully, to the conscience of its Western counterparts. In London, those letters were read through an entirely different lens. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston treated the whole affair as nothing more than illegal seizure of property, a blatant violation of British subjects' private assets. Two legal worldviews had collided head-on. China's internal moral prohibition ran straight into Britain's liberal free market legal order. The parliamentary debates and diplomatic correspondence from this period reveal a beautifully constructed ideological smokescreen. The British Crown was defending its right to freely sell in Asia a substance whose sale it tightly regulated in its own colonies. Palmerston operated on a rigid foreign policy doctrine. Any foreign interference in the commercial activity of the Crown's subjects had to be crushed by force. The confiscated opium became a convenient test case for rolling out gunboat diplomacy on a global scale. A British fleet sailed to the other side of the planet. Publicly, Whitehall talked about defending the principles of free trade. Privately, the letters between the men running the campaign talked openly about controlling the narcotics trade. The First Opium War exposed a staggering technological gap between the two sides and ended in the total defeat of the Qing Navy. In 1842, aboard a British warship, the Treaty of Nanking was signed. It became the first in a long line of agreements the Chinese themselves would later call the unequal treaties. The victor dictated the new reality. China was forced to open 5 key ports to foreign commerce, including the economic hubs of Shanghai and Guangzhou. Britain permanently claimed the strategically vital island of Hong Kong. Customs rules were rewritten to fix a humiliatingly low tariff on Western manufactured imports. One clause stood out above the rest: extraterritoriality. From then on, any British subject in a treaty port was placed entirely outside local Chinese jurisdiction, answerable only to their own consul. On top of that, Beijing was forced to pay a massive cash indemnity, financial responsibility for the opium that had just been dissolved in seawater was placed squarely on the losing side. The opium trade itself was never even mentioned in the Treaty of Nanking's text. On paper, it remained illegal, but the new structural conditions changed everything. Open ports, laughably low tariffs, and immunity from local prosecution meant the shadow trade came flooding back in, twice as strong. The imperial government had lost every lever of customs control it once held. For China's elite, this defeat was a genuine cultural shock, shattering the traditional order that kept barbarians bound to ritual and hierarchy. Rumors even circulated at court, blaming Lin Zexu's bluntness for provoking the entire catastrophe. Britain's economy celebrated the win. But this military victory came with an uncomfortable catch. The East India Company had cracked open a closed Asian market, forced its trade terms through, and successfully stopped the outflow of its own silver. The artillery had done its job, but the core problem in the whole trade chain hadn't gone anywhere. Gunboats could force China to buy whatever Britain wanted to sell, but they couldn't force it to hand over the secrets of growing and processing tea leaves. The keys to the world's botanical monopoly still sat locked away in remote mountain provinces the Royal Navy's guns could never reach. Getting the seedlings and the techniques out of China would be what finally broke that monopoly for good. The solution to this logistics problem was born nowhere near a government office or an Admiralty chart room. It came out of a house in London's East End, belonging to a physician and amateur botanist named Nathaniel Ward. He was simply trying to save his small collection of tropical ferns from the city's corrosive coal smog. In 1842, Ward published a detailed study on growing plants inside sealed glass enclosures. His invention, what history would remember as the Wardian Case, was a wood or metal frame fitted with tightly sealed glass panels. Inside, it created its own self-contained microclimate. Moisture evaporated from the soil, condensed on the cool glass, and trickled back down to the roots. This closed loop let plants survive for months with zero human intervention. Before this glass box existed, shipping living plants across the ocean was basically a gamble you were guaranteed to lose. Roots rotted instantly in the damp, dark hold. Leaves scorched on deck under the equatorial sun. Salt spray killed off delicate seedlings more reliably than any poison could. Moving key agricultural crops between continents was considered physically impossible. The Wardian Case smashed straight through that barrier. Early tests were staggering. Delicate Australian ferns survived the months-long voyage to Sydney without a problem. The East India Company immediately understood the real potential of this glass and condensation trick. It wasn't just clever gardening, it was strategic weaponry, and their agent's job was to go get the actual technology of growing and processing tea leaves. According to Fortune's own memoirs, he managed to smuggle out an extraordinary collection of genetic material from deep inside China. More than 20,000 living tea bushes made it onto the decks of British ships, along with tens of kilograms of premium seeds. Chinese farmers had believed for centuries that their tea leaves' unique qualities were inseparable from the local mountain air, the dense fog, and the specific soil of their homeland. Fortune loaded seedlings of these prized varieties into his sealed glass cases. The closed water cycle kept the plants alive on the long journey to Calcutta. The living cargo made it safely to India, where the colonial administration was already preparing a massive staging ground to launch full-scale agricultural production. Back in the 1820s, a British officer named Major Robert Bruce had already noticed wild tea trees growing in the dense jungles of Assam. This local variety had bigger leaves and a bolder, stronger flavor than the Chinese plant. British engineers planted the stolen elite Chinese bushes alongside it and began systematically crossbreeding the two. Assam's lowland plantations were soon joined by the highlands of Darjeeling. The cool Himalayan climate, constant cloud cover, and sharp temperature swings almost perfectly matched the conditions of the famous Wuyi Mountains. But good seedlings alone weren't enough for commercial success. The British still had no real understanding of how to process the raw leaf. Green leaves had to be rolled and fermented correctly to survive storage and shipping. Fortune had already planned for this. He'd secretly recruited and shipped Chinese tea technicians to India, and these hired experts set up fermentation and drying processes at the new experimental factories. Internal East India Company correspondence from this era reveals a striking contrast. While naval officers were demanding more cannon, the accountants were quietly bankrolling greenhouse construction. Careful, almost ceremonial hand cultivation gave way fast to ruthless industrial scale. Indian jungle was cleared to make way for endless, perfectly ordered rows of tea bushes. By the end of the century, where jungle had once stood, there was nothing but row after row of tea stretching to the horizon. The once mighty Qing Empire was left alone to deal with the wreckage, a population hooked on opium and an economy in ruins. The combination of a wild Assamese tea bush, Dr. Ward's clever glass box, and one very bold act of espionage turned out to be more effective than any amount of military force. The Wardian Case would go on to enable the mass transplant of rubber trees and cinchona bark, permanently reshaping global agriculture. The Trade Triangle finally closed entirely within the British Crown itself, cutting outsiders out of the equation for good. The entire military, logistical, and economic architecture of modern Asia was torn apart and rebuilt from scratch. And at the root of this massive historical turning point was something almost embarrassingly simple: the everyday need of millions of British weavers and London aristocrats for a cheap, hot cup of tea.